The primary election, the referendum, the initiative, the recall, the 17th Amendment. Why did the United States adopt all of these things in the early 20th century? And how successful have they been? Hi, I'm Evan Bennett, and I'm Professor of History at Florida Atlantic University and also Director of the Voting Rights History Civic Literacy Project. And I'm here with 3 things you need to know about progressive era reforms to elections in the United States. Before we get started though, it's probably best if I define all of those terms I just mentioned. The primary election is a system political parties use to select their candidates before a general election. The first primaries were held in the 1890s, and by the 1910s they were widespread. Originally, and in most states today, only those who are registered members of a party are able to vote in that party's primaries. However, some states today have what are called open primaries, in which any voter is able to participate. The referendum and the initiative are tools that allow voters to bypass the state legislatures and introduce laws and constitutional amendments themselves. Introduced in 1897 in Nebraska, they're used in 24 states today. Organizations interested in putting a law or an amendment before the voters collect enough signatures to have it then put on the ballot. In most cases, however, it requires more than a simple majority for that law or amendment to go into effect. The recall is an election that allows voters to, recall any elected official. It was introduced in Oregon in 1903 and remains the law in 19 states. The recall has never been widely used, but it was famously used in California in 2003 when voters there removed Governor Gray Davis in order to replace him with Arnold Schwarzenegger. The 17th Amendment was ratified in 1913, and it provides for the direct election of senators. Originally in the Constitution, the selection of senators was left up to state legislatures. The 17th Amendment changed the Constitution to require that all senators be selected by the direct vote of the people. Okay, now here are the 3 things you need to know about progressive era reforms to voting. 1. The creators of progressive era reforms believed that their reforms would make government more responsive to the demands of the people. In the late 19th century, reformers from across the spectrum, from farmers to workers to middle-class city dwellers, all believed that the American political system had failed to respond to the demands of an industrializing nation. Some blamed the 2-party system and tried to create third parties in order to challenge their dominance. Groups like the Populists in the 1890s, for example, or the Progressive Party in 1912. Others, however, believed that new tools could be created in order to pull power back from the elites they believed took away the voice of the people. Primary elections, for example, were created as a way to pull power back from the party elites who typically nominated candidates at political conventions that were not open to everyday voters. The referendum and the initiative, reformers believed, would allow voters to bypass legislators who were either too timid to deal with the problems of the era or, worse, were bought off by elites. The recall was designed to make sure that governors and legislators did exactly what the people wanted them to do. The 17th Amendment and the direct election of senators came as a result of a fear that state legislatures were simply too dominated by moneyed interests and that the senators never represented the interests of the people. In reality, however, by the time the amendment was passed, 29 states already had binding elections. 2. This can best be seen in the development of the so-called white primary in the southern states. By the 1890s, the majority of African American voters had already been excluded from the electoral process in the South. White Southerners, meanwhile, almost always voted for the Democratic Party's candidate in the general elections. This meant that the Democrats won nearly every election in the South. In order to ensure that the few remaining African American voters would have no ability to influence who the Democratic Party selected as its candidates, advocates of the primary system established that African Americans could not be members of the Democratic Party and therefore could not vote in the Democratic Party's primaries. The white primary effectively nullified whatever power black voters had after poll taxes and corrupt literacy tests robbed them of their vote. The white primary remained legal until 1944, when the Supreme Court struck it down in a case called Smith versus Allwright. The decision did not ban primary elections. It simply said that parties could not prevent someone from registering with that party based on race. 3. Many of these progressive-era reforms were rooted not only in the idea that money corrupted politics, but also in the idea that immigrant and working-class voters were also sources of corruption. Many reformers, especially middle-class urban reformers, felt that the greatest threat to democracy in the United States was the political machine. Political machines were organizations in many U.S. cities that harnessed the votes of immigrant and working-class voters in order to gain political power. They then used this electoral power to enrich themselves. The leaders of political machines often justified their actions by saying they simply provided services that their voters needed. Reformers also rightly pointed out that political machines often relied on corrupt practices, like sending voters to multiple polling places to cast multiple ballots in order to hold on to their power. Reformers sought many ways to undercut the power of political machines. One way was the at-large election. In the at-large system, voters selected from a slate of candidates who were to represent the entire city or the entire county. This differed from district systems that allowed each district or city ward to elect its own representative. Supporters of at-large voting argued that the system guaranteed that those people elected would have the best interests of the entire city or the entire county in mind when they made decisions. In reality, their goal was to dilute the power of ethnic and working-class voters by requiring that their candidates get the votes of citizens throughout the city. It was a reform rooted in fear. Progressive-era voting reforms are a reminder that election rules and methods are not always about finding the most purely logical way of running an election. In a democratic republic, all will claim that their reforms are about supporting and expanding democracy. This is not to say that there are not good reforms that expand democracy to more people and root out corruption in the election process. But even the best solutions are not free from political considerations. And sometimes, even good solutions have negative consequences for the people whose voices they propose to amplify.